This programme was produced at and first aired on MPR, Manawatu People's Radio, with support from New Zealand On Air. Ka pai Irarangi Tamotu, MPR.
Kia ora and welcome to Reserved Recommendations. This is a show about great trash, difficult art, and our complicated relationships with art and culture. My name's Hugh, I'm the host of the show, and I'd like to take this opportunity to put in a very mild content warning for the show as a whole. Sometimes our recommendations on this show are reserved just because the thing that we're discussing is in some way not good, but sometimes there are aspects of the art or artist that may be confronting for some people. Check the episode descriptions for more information, and do be aware of your listening environment. Kia ora and welcome to another episode of Reserved Recommendations. This is a radio show and podcast produced by Manawatu People's Radio. We look at usually... I like the term great trash more than guilty pleasures, because I don't think you should feel guilty about your pleasures, just acknowledge if they're things that are bad. But it's coming up to ANZAC Day, and I have complicated feelings about ANZAC Day, largely because of, well, stuff that we're going to talk about. So what I wanted to talk about today was like the stories that we tell about war and how those are different from what wars are and why they happen. And to help me do that, I have my friend Victor from the Rogue Insider podcast. Good evening, Victor. How's it going?
How you doing, Hugh? Nice to be on.
I'm doing very well, thank you. I am. This is actually recording in the morning because that's how we do these things, and so I am waiting to find out once I get off this call what happened with the fridge that is probably being installed at my house while I am at work. I am full of curiosity and trepidation about it, but it will be a black monolith, so I'm expecting to come home and find the family like banging bones on the ground and shrieking. Cool.
Oh, a nice little 2001
yeah.
experience in the kitchen. Why not?
That's the one. You've got to get these things in. So I guess by way of kind of setting the table, the reason that I wanted to talk to you in particular is because you have an actual qualification in geopolitics, and you have talked a bit about this on your own podcast. And so I guess the starting question, if I lay it out like the kind of construction of the problem of evil, if you like, which is like, looked at from a human perspective, war is uncontroversially bad. Like it destroys an enormous amount of resource and human life. The threat of like the unleashed and undisciplined soldier has been a psychological weapon of warfare going back to like classical antiquity. The idea that if you don't do what we want, we'll just let our guys off the leash and they will do the most vile shit that you can possibly imagine for 3 days. And yet, like war persists as a thing, and there have been like, it's very easy for artists to make grand statements about like, if we understand each other, there will be no war, or if we see each other's humanity, there will be no war. And we live in a world of states whose ostensible goal is to protect their citizenry. So therefore, how come war, basically? Mm-hmm. And I guess the reason that I want to ask you that is because my intuition is that the answer lies in how a state thinks about these things.
Well, that is my understanding. So my qualification to speak on this subject is that I did a master's degree of strategic studies here in Wellington at the Queen Victoria University Centre for Strategic Studies. And obviously all the errors that I'm going to make in this conversation are my own. They don't bear any responsibility for that. I spent a fair amount of time looking into the theoretical basis for warfare, why they occur, and across a fairly broad range of theoretical explanations for those. My own personal commitment is towards a variety of theoretical explanation, which is called offensive realism. Offensive realism has been in the news recently due to the fact that John J. Mearsheimer is the kind of central theorist of offensive realism, because of the recent events in Russia and Ukraine. The central text of this line of reasoning is called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. And it's a very simple line of reasoning. It says that intentions are unverifiable. So essentially, no states can really make promises. All states have some level of military power. So therefore, all states, in some sense, threaten all other states. And
well, it would follow from those that, like, since you can't tell what your neighbours are doing, and everyone's got at least a big stick, if not a gun under their bed, then you have to some extent, behave as though your neighbour is planning to hit you with the big stick.
That's exactly right. And so this causes arms races between states, and that these arms races necessarily make other states feel insecure. And when I say feel insecure, obviously states don't feel, because they are bureaucratic machines. And they respond to the things that are around them in the way that bureaucratic machines do, not with emotions, but by calculations.
I mean that's kind of a formulation which reminds me of like there's probably a proper philosophical name for this concept, but I've noticed it outside of state politics in like business or ordinary politics, or even just like personal relationships. I call it the ratchet of bastardry, but as I say, there's probably a better philosophical term for it. But basically, the idea is, if we assume for the moment that there is such a thing as objective morality, just for the sake of the argument, there are some things which are provably correct and some things which are provably wrong. If there is a thing which is provably wrong, which it still profits you a great deal to do, then someone's going to do it. And if someone does it and they profit, then it becomes the obligation of everybody else to also do that reprehensible thing, because otherwise the only person who's going to be profiting from the reprehensible thing is like the worst person. And you have this like ratchet of bastardry where even people who start with good intentions are put in a position where, in order to be able to function next to everybody else, they have to do this one awful thing. I can't. The tragedy is I can't see a way out of it necessarily.
Well, yeah, my investigations in the field have come to a similar conclusion, in the sense that I also don't see a way out of the tragedy of great power politics. I haven't found one. The only thing that I would add to your hypothesis of the ratchet of bastardry is that when thinking about states from a strategic studies perspective, we start from an amoral position, not because amorality is a good thing. That would be a crazy statement. It's only because we want to understand the situation first and then later come to it and make a moral decision about it. If states find themselves in these situations, or try and put yourself in a compassionate frame of mind and think about the decision maker whose responsibility it is to decide whether or not to go to war or not. They find themselves responsible for millions of people, and they're in the situation that we've described. They're being threatened by opponents on all sides. they might come to a standard bureaucratic decision that says, actually, it's better to go to war than not go to war at this moment in time. Now, there's a certain irony here that the people who originally joined up to the state for the purposes of protecting themselves find themselves in a situation of being recruited to the state as the state slides into war with its neighbouring states, thereby destroying the attempt to keep themselves safe. But it's still logical at every step along the way.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you made an interesting point about states behaving as bureaucratic machines, because I sort of 90% agree with it, but also they're bureaucratic machines made of people. So if you imagine a machine where individual components can be biased or wrong, you do end up with a more chaotic outcome than something kind of purely making rational decisions. I feel like.
Well, this is what the constructivist school of international relations argues, is that all results of international relations decisions become, because they exist in time, feedback loops, which feed back into the decision making. So in some sense, there's no escape even from ourselves, because whether a state or an individual, we're always compensating for the decision making that we've made in the past. And that this is what causes us to have these kind of weird psychological biases that curve people off into the sort of mental boxes where they feel like they can't make any decisions except for the ones that are in front of them, because they've become blind to everything else that's around them. And that's all well and good, but the study of strategic studies and the importance of decision making in international relations is not only a theoretical field, it's also a practical field. And so the reason why strategic studies attempts to cut away everything that is excess is to make it simple enough to make it usable. So even Mearsheimer says that his theory is probably only 80% right, and the remaining 20% you can fill up with whatever you like, whether it's cultural feedback loops or self-deception or pride or greed or anything else that you could conceivably lead to warfare, right? But the remaining 80% of the time, give or take, is probably fairly accurate as his contention.
Yeah, and I mean, certainly when you look at human history, what you see is a recurring pattern where through some quirk of technology or military or political organization, someone steals a march on their neighbors and then goes and stomps around the continent for a while, taking everything over until they kind of reach an equilibrium where either they overextend themselves or everybody else also has iron, and they get stopped. And so, I mean, that does seem to bear itself out over and over again. So I guess to take a step back, one of the reasons that I have very complicated feelings about ANZAC Day is that I do think that that people who have joined militaries often have either done so because they feel like they have no other options or because they genuinely thought that they were doing a good thing. But that when we do things like ANZAC Day, as it's done here in New Zealand, it's often with a kind of a chorus of fairly uncritically repeating the propaganda of the day about like what the war was and why it was fought and how, and that feels to me, firstly, like fundamentally dishonest, but also like it makes it much more difficult for people to have the kinds of discussions and thoughts that we are having right now about how do we get into these situations, how if we see that we're sliding into them, can we get out of them? If the answer is just like freedom, brandish fist, that's what you would call kind of like a thought terminating cliche, I guess. So like, I guess, do you have thoughts about how to break out of that kind of propaganda loop? Do you know much about like World War I in particular?
Do I know much about World War I? No, not especially. I have much less complicated feelings about Anzac Day than you do. I think it's unequivocally a good thing, and that the people of New Zealand should honour the sacrifices made of the soldiers in World Wars I and II, and that it's right to do so. The circuit breaker for me in thinking about how wars are started inside democracies is quite a simple one, which is that the demos doesn't get a say in whether or not the state goes to war or not. The decision is made by specialists. Now, many people will say, well, that doesn't sound very democratic. You're right, it's not democratic. It also doesn't sound very fair. Okay, fine, I'll fold on that too. It's not fair either. But would you rather have the decision to go to war made by specialists in their ivory towers and decision makers who sit on high perusing difficult decisions, who are not really connected to the lives of the common people and spend those lives in much the same way that they spend treasure? Or would you rather have the decision to go to war made on a democratic basis of people who don't have the time to think in depth about those issues and tend to be moved by the dramatic ethical issues of the day and can be swayed by good speech makers? I'm not saying that that's a decision that anybody should enjoy having to make, but those appear to be the two apparent options. And if both of the options are bad, is one of them less bad?
Yeah, I can certainly see the logic of that, and I guess this is not a counter argument to that, but I suppose it's given if we accept that point, which I think we probably have to, because of all of the stuff that we've already said, there is a continuing level of, I guess the word I'm looking for is probably like accountability there, in the sense that like we are a democracy, we do maybe we're a representative democracy. So what we do is we don't vote on decisions, we vote on the people that we think ought to be making the decisions by and large. That's how things work. Which, sure, fine. My point, I guess, is that when you have a relatively small cadre of people making decisions, those decisions become, while those people are specialists, increasingly personal to them. And that has, I think, led to situations where, for example, New Zealand has in the past purchased military hardware that's not of any particular purpose to it as a nation, because the idea was to be interoperable with gear that the US had, which makes a whole bunch of presuppositions about what kind of war we would be doing if we did war. And that seems to me like it could get you in difficult situations, because it's quite easy to if you think about it in terms of like just interpersonal relationships, it's quite easy to schmooze a small group of people. It's harder to schmooze an entire demos.
Well, I don't know if I agree with you. In a small group of people, the tendency is that someone, at least in the group, will take the opposing view and will attempt to say, no, that's wrong, even if they think that it's right. Whereas in large groups of people, being swept up in emotion by a good speech is perhaps even more common. Let me think. Okay, so here's an example, all right? In the United States, the Mearsheimer has argued that the foreign policy establishment ought to be foreign policy realists which is to say, to follow the argumentation that I've put forward, to say first, look at things amorally and then decide what to do once you understand the situation. But the foreign policy elite in the United States are not realists. They're liberal internationalists. They're internationalists in the sense that they believe that everybody in the world ought to have the human rights that the citizens of the United States have, and they're liberal in the sense that they think that that those rights apply to everyone and should apply to everyone. So
and also, like, I guess it's worth making this point because people get tied up with liberal sometimes. It's liberal in the sense that they think that, like, politics is a machine where if you get all of the rules right, then you will get a good outcome for everyone by making sure that all of the rules are right, rather than there being interests which need to be, like, either advocated for or against because they throw things out of whack.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a benefit maximization machine from their perspective. A moral person might look at those two options and say, well, clearly we should go for the one that wants the best for everybody. However, when we look at how things have gone, what has occurred for the foreign policy elite in the United States is that they have used moral arguments to compel the compliance of the population of the United States to agree with foreign policy actions that have had disastrous human consequences. Where actually, if they had stood back at the beginning and said, now that we understand the situation, although maybe it might be moral to attempt to do this, we're not going to do it because it wouldn't benefit us, frankly, a self-interested decision, the outcomes overall on a humanitarian level would have been far better.
Yeah, I think part of that, I mean, obviously I think you're right about the philosophical underpinnings. I think there's also a fundamental error in terms of the way that people or that these policy elites have tended to think about war. My metaphor, if you like, metaphors are good, would be that a war is kind of like setting fire to something, like just setting fire to a house that you don't want to be there anymore. You will get rid of the house, but there's a non-trivial possibility that you will inadvertently set fire to other things. And once you have an uncontrolled fire, it's very difficult to deal with. So when you're thinking about, like, it's the correct moral decision to remove this particular political leader, what you actually do is you go, we're going to just blow a hole in the politics of this country, and then that hole will be filled with whatever rushes into the vacuum, and we're not necessarily going to think especially hard about that. And so you end up with all of the complicated situations that follow American military actions everywhere.
I mean, the fact is you can't use a broadsword as a scalpel. And I would really like for the American foreign policy establishment to learn that lesson and amend their actions. But so far, none of the blowback or consequences have caused that to occur. So very likely, I assume they will continue to be true believers in liberal internationalism and continue to take these same counterproductive actions, which is a shame on a humanitarian level. But to extend your metaphor, if a war is burning down a house and all states are in a contested relationship with all other states, then me coming over to the suburb that you live in and burning down the house that is next to you, even if I can't plausibly defeat you in a war, and here I'll move away from the metaphor and make it explicit. If the United States wants to destroy Russia, but it can't because Russia has 6,000 intercontinental ballistic missiles armed with multiple entry launch vehicles for nuclear weapons, what I can do is burn down the house that is next to your house, and that gives you something to worry about.
Yeah, it's very hard for me to come and set fire to your house if I'm worried about mine catching fire because the one next to it is on fire, essentially.
That's right. And And by the way, this is exactly the same thing that Russia attempted to do with Cuba in the 60s. So again, I'm not making a moral argument, I'm making a strategic argument.
Yeah. I mean, the other way, thinking about it amorally would be to consider the world as like a game of Risk or something. You don't worry especially about the fate of any particular little yellow plastic cannon. We are getting close to the halfway mark. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a break for a couple of minutes, and we will be back right after this.
Support this show and others like it by giving a donation. For more information, go to www.mpr.nz/donate.
And we're back. This is Reserved Recommendations. It's a radio show and podcast about difficult relationships with art and culture and great trash. I'm talking today to Victor from the Rogue Insider podcast about like war and the ways in which we talk about war and the thing that it is. I guess if I can kind of pivot back to the start, we have a fundamental disagreement about I guess the ways in which we talk about war or foundational wars in New Zealand. And I'm willing to let that lie. That's not a fight that I necessarily feel that I need to have. But I do want to ask, as someone whose like academic career has been thinking about war in this and strategy in this very specific and professional way, like, what do you think is the appropriate way to tell stories about war? Because that is a thing that humans really like to do. And I guess the point that I was trying to make about Anzac Day is that I feel like in doing that, the same way that some Christians like unknowingly try and divine meaning from things that were like political jabs at specific Roman officials. We get people trying to make moral cases for particular modes of being or behavior on the basis of like old propaganda.
That's a great question and not one that I have thought of before. I think that we should tell stories about war. That's my first commitment. We're the same generation, so I imagine that you probably caught the tail end of this kind of etiquette of never discussing religion or politics at the dinner table. The problem with that, of course, is that you end up with people who have never heard a discussion about politics or religion, which are actually really important topics. So to avoid that error, I would really prefer it if we did continue to talk about war and discuss war and tell stories about war. I would much rather there be 100 different stories about any particular war and none of them agree with each other, and for there to be a long argument that plays out historically for 1,000 years of disagreement about any particular war, than for us all just to be silent and pretend that nothing happened.
I think that's what free speech philosophers would call the more speech argument, and I think it's a good one. I mean, in that vein, I think the thing that I would like in stories about war is for us to make sure that we go like a step further than what seems to be the neat ending. I have an example for that, which is you're familiar, I'm assuming, with like the Christmas truce from World War I. Mm-hmm. So in case anyone's missed that, because who knows, basically the story is that in the trenches on Christmas Eve, the troops on both the British and German sides called an impromptu truce and shared rations and played a game of soccer in no man's land. And it was this, there's been picture books and various things about it, and it gets shown as this sign of kind of mutual respect between the troops, which I think it is. And interestingly, like some of the some of the ANZACs who came back from Gallipoli wrote poems about like, while we think the Germans are a dirty pack of bastards, we think the Turks genuinely respected us, which I possibly. The point about the Christmas truce, though, is that it genuinely happened, but what ended it was that the generals got word that their troops were doing this and deliberately rearranged troop positions so that no one would be opposite anyone that they were familiar with anymore, and then arranged shelling using the other side singing hymns as a way of targeting them to like guarantee that there would be fighting spirit stirred up again. I think that coda is important, that there are these moments of humanity, but the machine does what the machine does. And if you have a sufficiently large and powerful machine and you chuck a spanner in it, then the spanner will get like munched up.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, look, I'm not making excuses for war. It's a horrible thing. Many, amongst the worst things that humanity can experience. And yet sometimes it's also the right decision.
Yeah, I think so. I think which is difficult, but I suppose the other thing that I would say is that now you'll know who the quote is appropriately attributed to, but the quote is that war is the continuation of diplomacy by other means.
That's Clausewitz.
Yes, right. But the implication of that is that if you hadn't failed earlier on in your diplomacy or the political process that led to that diplomacy, then you might not be having the war.
That's one lesson that we can draw from Clausewitz's comment that war is politics continued by other methods. But I think that what Clausewitz was getting at was that I think the point that he was trying to make, my interpretation, is that wars that are pursued for reasons other than a specific political outcome are nothing more than just vandalism. And I think that he came to that conclusion after the Prussian conflicts, that he realized that many of the battles that were being fought were just there because the other guy was there, and he's the enemy, so you fight him. Whereas actually, if you arrange all of your conflicts around a specific strategic endpoint that you want to focus on or achieve, then you can choose what to get involved in and what not to get involved in. And that if there can be a justification for war, the justification is probably there. And if you don't have one of those, then almost certainly there's no justification as possible.
Yeah. I guess the other thing I was thinking of there is, the classic example of the undeniably just war, or if people argue that there is such a thing as an undeniably just war, usually the example is the need to stop fascist expansion in World War II. And I think you can draw a pretty clear line from World War I to create the conditions for World War II. And also there were a number of specific and noticeable, not noticeable, like you can trace the chain of decisions that led to the Nazis gaining power within Germany to a group of people again and again and again going, well, we don't much like the look of these communists, and these guys don't like communists either, so I suppose we'll get them to help out the cops. And that kind of decision gets made again and again and again, and they gain weight and gain momentum. And so I guess the other thing I was thinking is that, the situation where there's something so bad that you undeniably have to fight it is probably the end result of a whole bunch of people making a whole lot of small decisions that this Hitler bloke might be a bit weird, but at least he's not a communist.
Well, a just war theory is fairly well studied, and the principles, the kind of ethical principles that underlie it, I think, are fairly well agreed on, right? Wars have to be defensive. They have to be pursued by appropriate means. Even if the other guy is committing war crimes, that doesn't give you a license to do so, right? Pretty standard kind of moral decisions. But like all theories, they last up until the moment where you start to apply them. If we accept the principle that the First and Second World Wars were essentially one war with a 20-year-long break in the middle to rest, rearm, and resupply so that they can continue it again, then you have to... You quickly arrive at the conclusion that there is no such thing really as a just war. That you can enter a war on the basis of just decision making, but you cannot pursue a war you can't pursue a war justly, because war is in itself a moral crime. So, and by the way, I want to make a point here: the moral crime of committing war can be a lesser moral crime than not going to war. And in my estimation, the vast majority of decision makers, generals, soldiers across the entire war-making spectrum of individuals are probably all, or at the very least the vast majority of them, making the correct moral decisions for their circumstances. It's just unfortunate that when you add it all up, the outcome is what it is.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about the kind of the individual soldier for a second, because again, like the idea of the soldier unleashed and undisciplined has been a psychological threat and continues to be, because if you're not hearing about soldiers doing truly awful things during a war, it's because that information has been suppressed for that particular war, or the press is not sufficiently interested in it. I guess what I wanted to say was I feel like that's a natural consequence of getting usually a young person and putting them in this completely insane situation for a while. I cannot see how that would not derail someone, which is the point of military discipline and all of those things. What responsibility do we have for those things, for the acts done by individual soldiers who have gone off the rails, but also, like, do you think it is the responsibility of a state to, like, commit significant resources to looking after those people? Because notoriously the idea that the public shunned Vietnam vets is right-wing propaganda created by the Republican Party, but the government didn't do very well by them. The begging Vietnam vet with no legs was a genuine phenomenon.
Mm. Well, when wars occur, they're always the first priority. So in a war, a state's only responsibility is to win the war, right? To achieve whatever, and presumably there's some strategic outcome that the war is focused on. So they should achieve that. That has to be the number one priority, because if that is not your number one priority, you're actually committing a worse sin against your soldiers by sending them into something that you personally are not committed to. You're asking somebody else to die for an end that you yourself are not even willing to, like, morally commit to, right? And that can't be a moral action as far as I can see it. So to ask a soldier to risk their life, you also have to be as equally committed, even if you don't take the same risks. Now, once the war is won, should the veterans be taken care of? Yes, obviously, right? There's no greater commitment to the survival of a state than to ask a human being to risk their life for it. So as far as I'm concerned, veterans that come home should be given everything that they're required to live out good lives, and nothing more should be asked of them.
So, I mean, I guess the thing that then comes after that is that vastly increases the treasure cost of warfare, because what you're saying is that not only are you buying the implements of war and paying the people to use them and paying to replace them when they get both the people and the implements when they get blown up, but you're also committing to this ongoing cost of everyone who comes back. Do you think that would change the equation because I don't think that you can argue that states do a good job of that now. Even now, I think states by and large are not great at it. Do you think that would change the equation for like the board game perspective in terms of how war is thought about?
Yes, and this is exactly the problem. It's an extremely uncomfortable moral dilemma for you. You've sent men to war. The ones that have survived have come home, and they deserve all of your gratitude and everything that you can give to them. However, all states are always at war with each other, basically. If my analysis is correct that all states are in competitive relationships with each other, then you're also all of the time at risk of preparing new young men to go fight new wars. And if you have $1, should you spend it on the men who deserve our gratitude, or should you spend it on the kids that you're about to go send to fight? I would think that the correct moral decision in that case is to spend it on the kids that you're about to send. And I imagine the veterans would probably agree with that.
It's the bastard ratchet strikes again.
Yeah, that's right.
So at the end of all of that, because we are approaching full time, how for people who would like to see less war in the world, how do you realistically pursue that aim?
Well, first let me be a little humble and say that every person who has attempted to answer this question first, either theoretically or practically, has failed. Okay, so I'm not expecting to come up with a good answer with this. But on the other hand, I'm not going to just throw my hands up, quote Herodotus, and say, war is the father of all, and he makes some men slaves and some men kings, and that's all there is to it. Right? We have to be committed towards minimizing war because war is a crime. I think that the best method for minimizing wars is for states to amorally calculate what is in their own best interests and pursue those interests. I think the attempt to moralize foreign policy only has contradictory results, and those contradictory results increase the amount of wars that are fought whilst not being committed to, and especially the consequences of those wars tend to be far worse on a humanitarian level. So I'm not happy with that answer because it appears to me that the best answer is a terrible answer, but it's better than the other ones.
Yeah, I suppose the other thing that one can do as someone who lives in a representative democracy is that one can insist on some scrutiny or some accountability of the specialists and the basis on which they make their decisions. Because I agree with you that having a core of specialists that largely at least know how to do the things that they're doing, even if you don't necessarily agree with their philosophy about which things to do, is better. But you need to have the avenue to have the argument with them about the philosophy as well. And so I guess putting pressure on your elected representatives around how do we have those discussions about what our nation's philosophical footing for war and conflict and global strategy is, because I think I think generally, he says, people who don't see the eventual video of this can't see the face I'm pulling, but generally, New Zealand is mostly making the right sorts of calls. Like, we're not stomping in on the coattails of America in quite the way that we did in the late 90s and early aughts.
But at some point, to some degree, this is praising a eunuch for chastity.
Although, I mean, yes, but you can imagine a situation where a metaphorical eunuch decides that they're going to claim that they're not a eunuch and attempt to go on a rampage and cause an enormous amount of problems.
With the greatest of respect, I think the idea that New Zealand's foreign policy is determined by anything other than complete agreement with the United States and Australia is very naive.
Do you think that there would be a gain in being more independent? I mean, that would seem to be consistent with the line that you were suggesting states should, as a rule, pursue.
No. I think that, New Zealand is blessed by the very rarest of strategic blessings, irrelevance. Thanks to the fact that we're far away from everywhere and our only close neighbour is someone who's basically the same as us, we have the opportunity to make mistakes or say things out of line. But the fact is that nothing that we do can alter what will occur in the international arena, which, again, that sounds like an insult, but it's actually a blessing for us, and we should be very thankful for it.
Yeah, to take a kind of example of New Zealand anti-war nationalist pride, it's hard to see a more geopolitically consequential nation taking the 1980s anti-nuclear stance in quite the same way and having as few consequences for that.
Well, that was basically a mistake. The Prime Minister was outside of radio range, so when they phoned him to ask him whether they should support it or not, he wasn't available, so the caucus made the decision. If you read the biography of, I forget the names, one of the caucus members who was present at the time, he said that decision was basically made in absentia and could just as easily have gone the other way. So as a level of and I know this offends our pride as New Zealanders, us, the small country standing up against the American Goliath and saying, no, it's morally wrong to pursue the use of nuclear weapons for strategic causes. But actually, that's not what happened at all. And
that does raise an interesting point, though, about the human cogs in the bureaucratic machines. There was a series, and I can't remember where it was now, but it was a series of videos on YouTube, like a history series looking at the causes and events leading up to the beginning of World War I. And one of the things that they mentioned, and of course this is a YouTube series, so go and do your own research with actual books if you want to be certain of what's going on. But one of the things they talked about is that there were a couple of points in the immediate lead up to World War I where arguably the war could have been prevented, but the difficulty was that communication relied on dudes being moved from place to place through relatively slow transportation. And so there were decisions that were made because diplomats literally arrived a couple of days late to deliver the message that they were supposed to deliver.
Well, if you look into the absolute debacle of, Austro-Hungary and the Franz Ferdinand and how that afternoon played out, the whole thing is ridiculous. But if you step back further from the kind of actual events on the ground, I mean, in my analysis, Europe has always been at war from Roman times until 1945. And then if you're willing to say that the division of Europe into NATO and the Warsaw Pact is a variety of war, just a stalled one, well, then you can say it was at war until 1991. So it was inevitable in my mind. No special circumstances were required for the First World War and the Second World War. The fact that technology got better and better just meant that it was inevitable that war would become so mechanized and brutal that people would start to go, I don't actually like this after all. And maybe the theoretical, honor and pride and defense of nation that people were invested in, and the excitement and butchery that young men enjoy, eventually became outweighed by the sheer brutality of artillery and gas. But if you follow that line of logic, it puts us again in a very uncomfortable position. What happens next?
Well, I mean, certainly the peculiar and specific brutality and sequence of disasters everywhere in World War I are a specific interaction between military doctrine that is no longer connected to the technology of warfare, technology evolving at different rates so that the weapons technology is more advanced than the communications technology, so you can kill people more effectively than you can move them, and politics that derive from an entirely previous global order of essentially royal family. Inbred people beefing over turf is the inbred cousins beefing over turf is the crude formulation. All of that stuff banging together is what made stuff so awful, and there is presumably a new disconnect brewing about the difference between the way that that war specialists think about war and the practicalities of what's actually happening on the ground.
Well, it was really only the nuclear standoff between the United States and Russia that put an end to constant continental European conflict. And if you believe the strategists and war theorists who are popular in this day and age, the United States is less and less interested in maintaining the world order that they had during the nuclear standoff, which means that very likely they will withdraw and uninvest from all of the places that they've been. And very likely all of those places that they withdraw from will start to resolve their security differences in a manner that they would prefer to, rather than the manner that the United States would have preferred. Or, to put it less politely, they will start killing each other again because the United States will stop telling them not to.
Not only will the United States not stop telling them not to, but I think you'll probably see, if you look into who is killing one another and why, if you look into who killed one another and why in the aftermath of colonial withdrawal, the breakdowns of the various European empires, often what had happened was that there was a particular subsection of society that the colonialists decided was more useful than everybody else and elevated to an administrative caste of some sort. And what you saw in the civil wars that followed the colonial power leaving was that rubber band snapping back. There'd been a disparity created, and the people who were getting murdered were either the undercaste because everybody else had all of the guns, or the administrative caste because everybody else had 50 years of being pissed off at them.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look at the shatter zones of American withdrawal, those are East Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe, right? And where are the primary conflicts where that's primary conflicts of those zones are Taiwan. Then in the Middle East, you have Israel, Saudi Arabia, Iran, right? That triad of countries that need to figure out what they're going to do. And then you've got what's occurring in the Middle East at the moment. The objection there, of course, you can say is that Taiwan is a US-China thing. Okay, I don't think that the US is going to withdraw from East Asia. But in terms of withdrawing from the Middle East, that's been happening. And will they withdraw from, if not NATO, at least from Eastern Europe? Well, that is ongoing. That quote-unquote game is still in play.
We are pretty much at time, so I don't know that we have reached a round conclusion, because basically I opened Pandora's box and all of the horrors in the world flew out just endlessly. So, I mean, that was to be expected, but nonetheless, there are two things I like to do at the end of these episodes. The first one is to ask you if you have any specific recommendations. So I guess in this case, is there fiction that you think does a good job of portraying this in particular, or is there non-fiction that you think would be accessible to someone who's not already in the academe that does a good job of unpacking this stuff? Because I guess, the difficulty with talking about things that people have studied from an academic level is that you can drop an awful lot of like momentous tomes that are completely unreadable to anyone outside the field on them.
Well, thankfully, strategy is fairly accessible. It doesn't require that much arcane knowledge. So if your interest is in why states go to war for each other, then I encourage you to read The Tragedy of Great Power Politics by John J. Mearsheimer. If your interest is what's going to happen next, there's a book which is coming out soon by Peter Zion, which I believe is called The End of the World is Just the Beginning. And Peter Zion I believe that's his fourth book that is coming out, but all of his books are very accessible, clear, easy to read, and give you a strong insight into where the world is at and why it is that way.
My recommendation would be for another podcast. There is a podcast called Lions Led by Donkeys, which is by a guy called Joe Kasabian. It's a historical look at military disasters and mismanagement in the military. But the crucial thing about it is that he is a guy who volunteered at 16 and went to Afghanistan and various other places. And so he has a very specific, like, soldier's eye view of why things go so spectacularly wrong. And it's a very interesting look into the kind of disconnect that can happen within the structures of war that lead to things just going disastrously off the rails. I guess in that metaphor of the house on fire kind of sense, and it is funny and sweary, which advantages for some people. The last thing I like to do is give you a chance to plug your shit. Where can people find the Rogue Insider podcast? What is it? Do you have other things that you would like them to put eye or earballs on?
Well, if you're interested in this sort of thing, you will find a small amount of it on the Rogue Insider podcast. We publish on Anchor, so that goes out to all of the major podcast providers, including Spotify. We're also available on YouTube. There's been a blank spot at the moment, seeing as I got the lurgy. But let me be frank with you, the majority of what I do is just read philosophy textbooks to the audience for those that can't be bothered reading them themselves.
Excellent. Well, and people can find you as Rogue Insider Podcast on Twitter as well if they would like to shout at you on the internet, which is not an especially productive thing, but sometimes people like.
Well, like Crumpy said, we don't know how lucky we are.
That's the one. Thank you very much for coming on the show, Victor.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Reserved Recommendations, a radio show and podcast from Manawatu People's Radio, Te Reo Irirangi o ngā tangata o Manawatu. The show was produced and presented by me, Hugh Dingwall, and I also composed our theme music. It's called Sack Jazz, and you can find it at wolfboy.bandcamp.com. If you enjoyed this show, why not go ahead and share it with a friend? You can find the last 10 episodes at npr.nz/show/reserved or wherever else you get your podcasts. If you want an episode older than that, try searching for Reserved Recommendations on YouTube. You can find me on Twitter at Objective Realty, or you can follow the show on Facebook. And finally, Manawatu People's Radio is a non-profit community access station. If you like this or any other piece of their fine audio programming, why not fling them $1 or $2? You can go to npr.nz/donate for more information on how to do that.